Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching.
Okay. So, welcome on this snowy afternoon to the third Italian Research Seminar event of the fall semester 2024. I'm Charles Levitt. I'm an Associate Professor of Italian and Film and Associate Director of the Center for Italian Studies. I'm so glad that you're here taking part, whether in person or on YouTube, and whether now live or if you're joining us at some future date. I want to also thank our co-sponsors for this event. So it's the Nanovic Institute for European Studies and the Center for Italian Studies, who have graciously made this this afternoon's lecture possible. The Italian Research Seminar Series is a core event of the Center for Italian Studies. It aims to provide a regular forum for faculty, postdoctoral scholars, graduate students, and colleagues from other universities to present and discuss their current research. And we always emphasize that current research, that this is a place to share, to discuss, to debate work in progress. The seminar is vigorously interdisciplinary and embraces all areas of Italian literature, language, and culture, as well as perceptions of Italy, its achievements, and its peoples, and other national and international cultures. And the seminar constitutes an important element in the effort by Notre Dame Center for Italian Studies to promote the study of Italy and to serve as a strategic point of contact for scholarly exchange. And I think this afternoon's lecture is an ideal example of what that means to us. And so I want to welcome now our speaker, Nicoletta Pireddu, who's the inaugural director of the Georgetown Humanities Initiative and professor of Italian and comparative literature at Georgetown University. Her research revolves around European literary and cultural relations, cosmopolitanism, borders and migration, history of ideas, and translation studies. She's published over 80 articles and numerous award-winning monographs and edited volumes, among them Antropologi, alla corte, della bellezza, decadenza ed economia simbolica nell'Europa fin del secolo, which received the American Association for Italian Studies Book Award. And most recently, Migrating Minds, Theories and Practices of Cultural Cosmopolitanism, which won the 2023 American Comparative Literature Association's René Wellek Prize for the Best Edited Essay Collection. And Professor Pireddu's lecture this afternoon is entitled The Activism of Imagination, Fictions of Europe Between Utopia and Disenchantment. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Professor Levitt, for this beautiful introduction, and thanks all of you for the warm welcome that you have reserved to me and for the wonderful conversations that we've already had since this morning. I welcome the opportunity to share with you a little bit of my work in progress. It's a book I'm writing, and I can start with this initial consideration. It revolves around Europe, and I want to say that this is not just my impression, but the starting point for my research, the fact that at key moments in Europe's institutional and cultural history, and also increasingly so in the present, the Euro-building design has functioned and continues to function as a sort of ideological battleground between the pessimism of the Eurosceptic, if not Europhobic intellect, and the optimism of the Europhile's will. For each conceptualization of the European project and of the very idea of Europe, we can find another one that contradicts it. For every Ortega y Gasset, a Hans Magnus Enzensberger, for every Jeremy Rifkin, a Pierre Manon, for every Ida Magli, a Jürgen Habermas or an Anthony Pagden, for every Massimo Cacciari, a David Sassoli, and we could go on. But if there is one element, in my view, that enjoys broad consensus, this is the need to treat Europe and Europeanness, no less than nation and nationness, as imagined notions, as cultural artifacts, in the sense given to these terms by Benedict Anderson. Yet, precisely if we accept that Europe is the result of invention and representation, my question is, what is the role that the imaginative and symbolic form par excellence, namely literature, can play in those allegedly discursive and fictional productions? This is my underlying question. And my answer is, as I hope to show, a central role, although still far from central in the available cultural histories of the European design. The shift from thinking and rethinking to imagining and reimagining Europe foregrounds literature's performative and transformative force. I argue that the productivity of the narrative imagination and literature's creative ability to do and make things activate models of Europeanness that not only engage critically with past and current Europe-building projects, but also materialize new scenarios. The overarching theoretical principle in my overall project is Paul Ricoeur's notion of productive imagination, the power of an image to generate a world of its own that enlarges our world, opening up reality to new possibilities. Ricoeur considers imagination the prerequisite for action and the very instrument of the critique of the real. And he conceptualizes fiction as the prototypical locus of imagination's productive activity, because fiction does not mimetically transpose reality, but rather reshapes it by creating its own reference. Yet Ricoeur extends his idea of imagination beyond the literary realm, rendering it a social imaginary, the general function of developing practical possibilities in the cultural, social, and political spheres. He examines in particular its relationship to two interdependent imaginary practices, namely ideology and utopia. The first, ideology, moves towards integration, repetition, reflection. The second, because it is eccentric, tends towards wandering. But it is precisely its special extraterritoriality that ascribes to utopia the fictional power of redescribing life by redirecting action in new ways and extending the field of the possible beyond that of the real. Utopia's most basic function for Ricoeur is precisely the development of new alternative perspectives. It is at the intersection of imagination, fiction, and utopia as forces simultaneously constitutive and critical of reality that I situate my exploration of the question of Europe in what I define as the literature of the European consciousness, namely a plurality of European works spanning from the 19th century, when the nation-state consolidates, to the present, which I examine for the first time as a distinct corpus that foregrounds enduring European concerns in the collective imaginary, engaging with the complex, mutable, and contradictory ideas of Europe. As I hope to show, this literary corpus is an unavoidable component of the cultural history of the idea of Europe across space and time, and a pivotal interlocutor in the interdisciplinary debate on the opportunities and challenges of the Europe-building design. In the search for a European symbolic patrimony, the literature of the European consciousness, I claim, constitutes an effective site of memory in the sense that Pierre Nora ascribes to his concept of lieu de mémoire, namely tangible or immaterial objects belonging to or expressing a communal past and having a symbolic significance for a group. However, imagination does not only produce images to crystallize them in memory or to reinvent and reconstruct the past. Literature's ability to imagine differently and to make the absent present also involves the future, anticipating and testing still unrealized scenarios. Tonight I wish to linger on a selection of Italian fictional works that, in dialogue with my wider European corpus, not only offer critical reflections, but even foresee crucial aspects of the current European design, whether supporting or problematizing it, but enhancing a European consciousness nonetheless. What connects these narratives is the constructive power of utopia, not as compensatory wishfulness, but rather as projective planning. I argue that it is not despite, but because of their engagement with utopia that pro-European narratives can function as a critical and transformative, future-oriented political force. And predictably, especially for you, we have seen a nice picture of Mazzini in your lounge together with Dante. We can start from Giuseppe Mazzini, not just as the founder of La Giovane Italia and La Giovane Europa, but also the author of the 1829 essay D'una letteratura europea, where he upholds the union of thought and action, of culture and politics, crucial to an authentic Europe of the people. Since the opening citation from Goethe, which prefigures the dawn of a European literature, created with the contribution of all the people but not appropriable by any, Mazzini recognizes a European tendency, a harmony, he says, of needs and desires, leading nations to a single destination. We can say that despite his feverish involvement in Italy's unification, Mazzini here denationalizes patriotism in the sense that he purges it of autochthony and of exclusionary loyalty. Only by overcoming blind national vanity and prejudices will it be possible for him to turn inequalities among peoples into differences able to preserve pluralism and tolerance. By becoming European, as Mazzini urges, literature represents the first civic and political institution able to demonstrate, as he says, that the particular history of individual nations is about to end and European history is beginning. Mazzini grasps the poietic, meaning the constructive power of literature, as an expressive medium that not only reflects reality vicariously, but even anticipates and shapes it. In this age, he says, also the task of literature changes, and while it earlier used to express and to follow, now it precedes and foresees. Therefore, while Mazzini admits that the prospect of a European literature may be scornfully labeled as a dream, as often happens with ideas that are ahead of their time, he trusts in the power of time to impress the seal of facts to truth. Precisely through its symbolic and imaginary pursuits, literature fosters that emotional and aesthetic cohesion that for him can construct a shared European space. Mazzini's thought exemplifies a pro-European political and cultural discourse that develops in parallel with the nation-building project, and even precedes the better-known pioneering conceptualization of the United States of Europe, usually associated with Victor Hugo's famous address to the leading European powers at the 1849 Third International Peace Congress in Paris. A day will come for Hugo when war will seem as absurd between Paris and London, or Vienna and Turin, as a conflict between Rouen and Amiens, or Boston and Philadelphia. Without losing their individuality, all nations of the continent, for Hugo, will merge tightly into a peaceful superior unit and achieve the so-called European brotherhood. Mazzini's Europeanism, no less than Hugo's United States of Europe, contains the premises of other Italian standpoints that develop in their century. For instance, philosopher Carlo Cattanèo's transnational unitary design in his 1849 dell'insurrezione di Milano, inspired by the federal democratic models of the United States of America and of Switzerland, sheltered, according to him, from authoritarian excesses. And to Cattanèo's famous claim, avremo pace vera quando avremo gli Stati Uniti, he says, gli Stati Uniti d'Europa, we can also add Giuseppe Garibaldi's appeals in favor of fraternity and peace, guaranteed by a European confederation, leading to the creation of the League for Peace and Freedom in collaboration with Victor Hugo and John Stuart Mill, and to its multilingual periodical Les États-Unis d'Europe. In this Europeanist debate, fiction offers a pioneering, expressive, and transformative contribution, demonstrating not simply historical awareness, but also agency. And there isn't a more faithful example of loyalty to Mazzini's visionary cultural Europeanism, according to me, than the 1855 novel Dr. Antonio, written in English from Paris by the Italian novelist and Risorgimento patriot Giovanni Ruffini, himself much Europeanized because of his political exile in Great Britain and France. It is the tormented love story between a noble English young lady, Lucy Daven, visiting the Liguria region with her father, and a physician who expatriates from the kingdom of the Two Sicilies during the anti-Bourbon insurrectional movements and cares for Lucy after she's wounded in the collision of their respective carriages. You have an illustration there. Against the backdrop of physical and behavioral stereotypes, very predictable, the fair-skinned, blonde, proud, aloof British aristocracy, and the dark, passionate, southern Italian temperament, the apparent gap between the two national cultures seems unbridgeable. Yet Ruffini undermines binarism and the ideological barriers that obstruct a wider European vision by highlighting the empathetic communion between Dr. Antonio and Lucy. Lucy wants to know Italian culture. Antonio, like Ruffini himself, speaks English and French. And literature offers them the ideal tool to transcend the national imaginary and build, let's say, a cultural homeland that promotes reciprocal understanding through dialogue. From Milton to Giusti, from Manzoni to Shakespeare, the most important European authors foster an intellectual and emotional complicity between Antonio and Lucy. Antonio claims that Shakespeare is really truly one of his poets, just as Dante can speak directly to Lucy's heart. Ruffini hence substantiates Mazzini's belief that literature requires un concetto europeo, at once aesthetic, moral, and political, because it is this symbolic production that, shared by all, while not the object of exclusive ownership, facilitates the transition from the national to the supranational sphere. Yet, also the political dimension of this European future materializes in Italian fiction, thanks to the vivid federalist imagination of two eclectic late 19th century authors, Antonio Ghislanzoni, poet, journalist, novelist, but probably mainly known as Giuseppe Verdi's librettist, and Paolo Mantegazza, the father of Italian anthropology, but also a veritable Renaissance man, for those who do not know him, senator, pathologist, traveler, many, many things, and novelist. Ghislanzoni's futuristic novel, Abracadabra, Storia dell'Avvenire, 1864-65, and Mantegazza's L'anno 3000, Sogno, 1897, share a detail of remarkable documentary relevance. Their respective plots stem from an explicitly European institutional structure, namely l'Unione Europea in Abracadabra and the Stati Uniti d'Europa in L'anno 3000. Abracadabra transports us to 1977, when l'Unione Europea was formed out of a patto federativo di tutti i popoli d'Europa. After the word Italiani managed to bring together citizens separated by natural barriers and inherited provincial stereotypes, a common Latin identity merged them with the French, Spaniards, and Portuguese in conflict with German and Slavic people. Yet these intra-European conflicts rapidly dissolve when confronted with the most problematic component of this transnational design, the usual suspect, England. Unable to decide with which faction to side, England is ultimately made to sink in the ocean, and its much welcome disappearance accelerates l'unificazione completa di Europa. If during the Brexit negotiation people had read Ghislanzoni, the process would have been much faster. So you see, literature is always useful. But after making Europe, Ghislanzoni also makes Europeans much faster than in our present. By universal suffrage already from 1930, the rappresentanti del popolo europeo are elected to the Unione Federativa, which in 1977 also enjoys a constitution, one much more thorough than our Treaty of Lisbon, which was ratified, as you know, in 2009 after a very tortuous process. And Ghislanzoni's European Union is composed of 24 departments, so not too far from our 27 member states, each including municipalities with political representations at monthly departmental assemblies and general semi-annual congresses of the Union in Berlin, a brilliant anticipation of the Council of our own European Union. Europe in Abracadabra also shares a lingua cosmica, initially a radically new idiom and alphabet, but later represented by French, which the Latin race imposed to the Union in 1925. And in light of this linguistic detail, it would not be too surprising if Paolo Mantegazza had precisely Gilles Lanzoni in mind while working on his futuristic novel L'anno 3000. Mantegazza's fourth millennium, too, has been speaking la lingua cosmica for 5 centuries, expanding from the Stati Uniti d'Europa to gli Stati Uniti planetari. Paolo, the narrator and protagonist of L'anno 3000, retrospectively reconstructs the events that led to the creation of the United States of Europe, beginning prophetically with a terrible fratricidal war that lacerated the old continent at the beginning of the 20th century, prompting the search for an antidote to future violence. Europeanism in the novel hence emerges as a pacific and permanent solution to conflict, to be guaranteed by an international political institution according to the rhetoric that will inform actual political debates after World War I. After 2 years after the publication of L'anno 3000, at the outburst of the Spanish-American War for the liberation of Cuba, however, the noted English reformer and journalist William Stead, in his essay The United States of Europe on the Eve of the Parliament of Peace, will advocate precisely the realization, and here I'm quoting, of the conception which has hitherto been confined to idealists like Victor Hugo or seers like Mazzini, namely the United States of Europe as a fraternal federal union without armaments or hostile frontiers, and in very Mantegazzian terms, its ultimate universal extension to the United States of the world. How? Thanks to the abatement of all commercial and institutional barriers that preserve the structural rigidity and the particularisms of the nation state, and that also Mantegazza's novel erases: abolition of customs, the overcoming of distances and natural geographical borders through tunnels, railways, and telegraph, and last but not least, through a common currency. Although marginal and certainly not masterpieces, Gilles Lanzoni's and Mantegazza's novels hence deserve to be remembered as pioneering creative acts that give birth to Europe in the imaginary realm, enacting precise measures well before real-life institutions conceptualized them, and in dialogue with intriguing explorations of transnational and supranational possibilities that were developing on different fronts. Indeed, if you take a look, this is just a snippet, between 1886 and 1912, a wealth of allegedly universal linguistic projects aiming to transcend the language-nation dichotomy proliferate, keeping good company to the two best-known turn-of-the-century European linguistic constructs, which are Esperanto and Volapük, and often being modeled, as you can see, upon specific European idioms. Likewise, between 1865 and 1891, the Latin Monetary Union, initially including France, Belgium, Italy, and Switzerland, and gradually expanding to other member countries, introduced a standard mint ratio with the ultimate goal of creating a Europe-wide bimetallic system. These widespread expressions of belonging, we can say, to a community of cultures with shared aims, will, of course, not avert the destruction of the European brotherhood longed for since Mazzini and Hugo. The predatory instincts of European states attacking one another are magnified in the humorous map of Europe that I chose also as an image and background for my talk. It was produced in 1914 by Portuguese modernist painter and illustrator Antonio Soares, and it condemns the major powers of Europe as ferocious beasts, as you can see, engaged in plunging the continent into the great conflagration of World War I, while marginal countries, if you see, many of them neutral, are represented by more specific Pacific animals. In less than 2 decades, however, the very idea of a united Europe would paradoxically become an instrument in the service of continental hegemony, appropriated by the Nazis and fascists as the principle of a new exclusionary order against the alleged Asiatic Jewish Bolshevik Eastern Bloc and the Anglo-American one to the West. Hitler's regime increasingly deploys Europeanist themes in his radical conservative nationalist propaganda, and Mussolini too, at the 1932 Convegno Volta, for instance, imagines Europe as an economic and political supranational organization of national societies sharing the fascist doctrine. The co-optation of the idea of Europe by this extremist, pure internationalism predictably spreads to the cultural and artistic spheres as well. It undergoes a process of Aryanization, of which the official Reich painter Werner Peiner offers a blatant example with this reconfiguration of the founding myth of the abduction of Europa, daughter of the king of Phoenicia, here anything but Mediterranean looking, demurely waiting to be impregnated by Zeus, transformed into a white bull, led by 2 equally blonde, fair-skinned girls. Nonetheless, precisely at these tragic junctures of Italian and European history, the utopia of the United States of Europe resurfaces, gradually moving from intellectual discussions to diplomacy and ultimately to a political program. In 1923, with the foundation of the Pan-Europa movement, which, by the way, attracted the cultural elite in Europe from Freud to Rilke, Mann, and Benedetto Croce, Count Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, whom Hitler labeled as cosmopolitan bastard, revives the political imaginary of an alternative Europe, transforming the ailing continent from a powder chamber of international conflicts into a peaceful federal union. In the name of this Europe, the anti-fascist organization Giustizia e Libertà, founded in Paris in 1929 by Italian political refugees Carlo Agnello Rosselli, Emilio Lussu, and Ernesto Rossi, begins its resistance against Mussolini's regime. Essays like Filippo Turati's 1929, Gli Stati Uniti d'Europa e il fascismo, and Carlo Rosselli's 1935, Europeismo Fascismo, situated the idea of the United States of Europe within a lineage of democratic aspirations headed by the grande apostolo repubblicano Giuseppe Mazzini. And it is precisely in Mazzinian terms that Rosselli frames his belief in the need to fare l'Europa. Are we raving? He asks. No. The utopia of today can be the reality of tomorrow. And in this case, the reality of tomorrow are United States of Europe, Assemblea Europea. The rest, he concludes, is idle talk and catastrophe. The assassination of the Rosselli brothers by right-wing thugs on behalf of the Italian fascist government in 1937 thwarts the Europeanist proposals of Giustizia e Libertà, and Coudenhove-Kalergi's pan-European hope to avoid a war of the future underestimated by people's weak and backward-looking imaginations would be shattered by a new worldwide conflict, extending the already long trail of European bloodsheds. Yet within a synergy of idealism and pragmatism, the Euro-building project continues to nourish the dreams and designs of the 20th century with the enduring contribution of both political thought and literary creativity. For Austrian writer Stefan Zweig, it is the idealized intellectual brotherhood of his world of yesterday that embodied the retrotopia, in this case, of a peaceful and forever lost European community, which he leaves behind as a kind of nostalgic literary testament before taking his life, unable to cope with its destruction. For his part, French novelist, diplomat, and World War II aviator Romain Gary, in his 1945 novel A European Education, celebrates the unifying and healing power of literature above national political divisions, persuaded as his protagonist that art in war-torn Europe is a shelter against despair. In Italy, distinct voices decry lack of participation precisely in this transnational cultural realm. The pioneering magazine Il Baretti, launched by liberal intellectual Piero Bobetti in 1924, aims to Europeanize Italian literature as a form of cultural and political renewal by looking beyond the borders of the nation. Likewise, writer and dramatist Leo Ferrero opens his 1928 essay Perché l'Italia abbia una letteratura europea, published in the literary magazine Solaria, by declaring that Italian literature has given up on Europe, enclosed in its intellectual isolation, as the sad contention between strapaese and stracittà well demonstrated. Indeed, what is called European literature is the literature that depicts one's own country while implying others. Intellectual Italy for Ferrero is no longer aware that it is living in Europe. While the literature of all Europe has gradually unified, Italian literature has lost the sense of the universal and of tradition. Yet paradoxically, it is precisely from an initial adhesion to strapaese at the polar opposite of the European openness advocated by Bobetti and Ferrero that a very controversial writer morphs into what critics will label as an exemplary European. I'm talking about German-Italian Curzio Malaparte, né Kurt Erich Suppen. Originally a supporter of fascism in hopes of social revolution, but soon very critical of Mussolini and Hitler, sentenced to a 5-year confinement and later also placed under house arrest, Malaparte is shaped by a vast international culture and life experience, coming not only from long periods that he spent in Paris, but especially from his covering of the war as a correspondent for the newspaper Il Corriere della Sera. Malaparte's view of Europe from Nazi-occupied Poland, Finland, and the Ukrainian and Smolensk fronts will imbue his 1944 semi-fictional memoir, Caput, which is really a collage of recollections and meditations between visionary realism and imaginary evocation. Through conversations with an international multilingual aristocracy and war's military and political protagonists, Malaparte exposes the material and moral collapse of a civil Europe, the horrific extinction of a once luminous civilization of which his high-ranking interlocutors are, we could say, the last vestiges. All that is noble, gentle, and pure in Europe is dying, he asserts. Arguably, the subjects of Caput's harrowing European history are the bodies of the victims, humans and animals alike, be it the Italian consul in Jassy, buried under mounds of corpses of deported Jews, or the pack of dogs loaded with explosives blowing up under the German tanks. Even the German army for him is part of this general decay, all at the mercy of the real protagonist of the novel, the gruesome monster, the hard, mysterious German word Kaput, which literally means broken, finished, gone to pieces, gone to ruin, the sense of what we are, of what Europe is, a pile of rubble. In his subsequent novel, La Pelle, The Skin, 1949, all the rubble of Malaparte's European homeland symbolically converges in Naples, brutalized in this case by the Allies' occupation, which Malaparte represents as often barbarically violent and morally devastating. After the Germans have wiped out the cities and history of a continent, and as the terror of the Soviet dictatorship is pressing on the borders of Europe, the depersonalizing dominance of crude US materialism that offers the only possible rescue in the conflict confirms for him even more perversely the deleterious strength of the nation state. It makes individuals ready to kill in order to save their own skin, in a sense nullifying lives sacrificed in the name of noble ideals, as in this cynical dedication at the opening of the novel to all the good, honest soldiers morti inutilmente per la libertà dell'Europa. However, despite the debacle that he witnesses, Malaparte remains convinced that the future will be European and that Europe will not have a future unless these internal fractures between states are healed. He bets on what Ernst Bloch's theory of utopia would be the not yet, preferring to start anew from this Caput Europe rather than accepting the Europe of yesterday as if it were an immutable heritage, so in a sense, unlike Stefan Zweig. His wager against violence and oppression in Europe is on liberty and respect for culture and through culture. Indeed, recognizing that Italian and European literature has been at the forefront of events, as we see in È stato lo specchio anticipatore, Malaparte upholds its imaginative power as he goes as far as claiming if European politicians had looked more carefully at literature, they would have seen that it already perceived the Europe of today, the spirit that dominates Europe today. Malaparte's denunciation of the physical and moral degradation inflicted upon the peoples of Europe by the aberrant excesses of the state apparatus recalls, in my view, not only what Hannah Arendt discusses as the pervasive transformative effects of totalitarianism on human nature itself, but also anti-fascist political theorist Altiero Spinelli's attack on the absolute sovereignty of national states. In his 1941 Per un'Europa libera unita, for a free and united Europe, also known as the Manifesto di Ventotene, from the island where he was interned by the fascist regime, Spinelli recognizes that the ideology of national independence fostered progress on the one hand by undermining parochialism and localism and promoted wider solidarity against foreign oppressors. However, it contained the germs of capitalist imperialism that led to the formation of totalitarian states and to 2 world wars. The only way out of this crisis for him is a European federation, which will move Europe from what he says is the pacifism of previous projects to an active one, a veritable program. He talks about a long march through the institutions, culminating with a European Parliament able to act as a constituent assembly. Although Spinelli's project was initially obstructed by the governments of the member states, it gave impetus to subsequent major efforts towards European integration. However, and this is the twist, once the European Union is finally formed, we could say that integration becomes a victim of its own success. And my question at this point is, what is a united Europe's new raison d'être once it is no longer propelled by its early 20th century impetus to end its history of antagonisms, warfare, and domination, and to avert the return of horrors like Nazism and the Holocaust? For some, like Jürgen Habermas, the European Union must become a full-fledged supranational democracy by widening the competencies of its organs in order to acquire stronger legitimation. By contrast, for others, like German writer Hans Magnus Enzensberger, European institutions are a monstrous authoritarian state apparatus causing political disenfranchisement. Anti-Euro militants like Alberto Bagnai indict the single currency for allegedly depriving countries of their independent exercise of monetary policy and generating crises that have impaired the economic efficiency of the Eurozone. As a whole, the widespread perception of Europe as coterminous with the allegedly top-down EU administration, massive bureaucracy, and technocrats' inflexible parameters that hinder the participation of many stakeholders and entire member states has eclipsed, we could say, the philosophical complexity of the discourse on Europe and extinguished its emotional thrust. Literature, too, has a say on this disillusionment for the status of institutional Europe. José Saramago's 1986 novel, The Stone Raft, for instance, denounces the EU's alleged promise of equality and cooperation betrayed by an arrogant self-centeredness, disavowing its own peripheral south as mere spurious fragments that can wrench themselves away from the continent, which is what happens literally to the Iberian Peninsula in the novel, without causing the Union any shock or pain. Tim Parks, in his 1997 novel Europa, about overly optimistic foreign language lecturers traveling to Strasbourg to seek the EU Parliament's support against discrimination by the Italian government, debunks the EU's rhetoric of unity and the ability of its institutions to have an impact upon individual nations' lives, a disconnect that for Parks is reinforced by the cold anonymity of the EU symbols from the flag to the euro notes. Robert Menasse in The Capital 2017 and its sequel Die Erweiterung, The Enlargement, not yet translated into English, sarcastically portrays the political contradictions and challenges of a EU unable to transcend a myopic status quo thinking and still plagued by nationalist and racist sentiments. But if a Europe amounting to the sum of its communitarian institutions is reductively considered a failed or incomplete superstate, unable to grant a veritable unification, be it in the form of a federation or a post-national constellation, its motto, unity in diversity, also inspires broader cultural visions that prioritize Europe's multiplicity over its aspiration to wholeness and coherence. French philosopher Edgar Morin, for instance, in Penser l'Europe, presents Europe as a polycentric and polycultural reality, whose political and cultural originality lies not only in its active complementarity, but also in the permanent conflictuality of its many legacies, and in the dialogue of these pluralities. And Svetan Todorov, in his 2014 talk, In Search of Europe, at the Council of Europe, interprets European unity not as the ability to unify, but as a way of giving diversity the same status as identity. Can the rediscovery of this foundational pluralism be the guiding principle and the creative practice for this new Europe? According to philosopher Massimo Cacciari in Occidente senza utopie, while the form of utopia analyzes subjects and energies in progress and orients them towards a paradigmatically valid future, no utopia and no project for the future can develop in our present due to the lack of any veritable hegemonic perspective able to generate dialectical confrontations after the conquest of the rule of law and democracy. For his part, however, Paul Ricoeur validates utopia as an unavoidable condition of possibility of democratic life itself and a crucial component of identity. The ruling symbols of our identity, he claims, derive not only from our present and our past, but also from our expectations for the future. What I call the identity of a community or of an individual, he says, is also a prospective identity. What we call ourselves is also what we expect and yet what we are not. It is this duality of faces that may be constitutive of imagination itself. Precisely through imagination, in the time I have left, I wish to linger on the projective quality of two interrelated ideas that explore Europe's diversities, tensions, and concurrences as constitutive of the pluralistic identity of the new Europe, namely fluidity and translation. I begin from Claudio Magris and his 1986 novel, essay, travelogue, memoir, Danubio. The eponymous river makes and remakes Europe as the traveler follows its meanders across 7 European nations and endless geographies, cultural sites, and literary loci, from its elusive source to the uncountable branches of its delta, peacefully flowing into sea waters. In line with the hybrid form of the book, and in contrast with the Rhine, the mythical custodian of the purity of the race, the conceptually fluid Danube embodies for Magris the image for the questioning of a stable, monolithic, and imperious identity. Hence also the antidote, we could say, to the rigid boundaries of home and homeland. Magris thus redefines borders as thresholds that debunk the myth of the other side by foregrounding the intrinsic alterity within self-sameness. The coexistence of permanence and mutability, rootedness and errance in Danube tempers exclusionary differentiation with liquidity as epic abandonment to the new and the unknown, while never trespassing into the anarchy of indistinction. German sociologist Ulrich Beck equates the nation-state mold of thinking about Europe to a regulatory harmonization policy that, by confounding unity with uniformity, abolishes differences. By contrast, he proposes a cosmopolitan empire of Europe that, building upon the existing nation-states but emptied of imperial predominance, prioritizes openness and cooperation, reconciling two mutually exclusive demands: the call for the recognition of difference and the call for the integration of divergences. What is still a utopian scenario in the political institutional domain takes shape in Magris's literary space, as the Danube's openness to life's deformities delineates nell'Europa as a polycentric, plurinational network of peoples, cultures, and sovereignties, where the anthem, he says, is sung in 11 different languages, arranged in an ever-provisional equilibrium that the Habsburg government committed to preserving, accepting heterogeneities and contradictions. Yet Magris underscores that nell'Europa does not simply correspond to the geopolitical idea of Central Europe. It is a richer, more complex reality in which literature contributes in a fundamental way to the sense of belonging to a plural Danubian culture, because, Magris says, it is the essence or true face of history. Literature for Magris embodies that which has no existence yet except in words. It works as a force latent in reality, with the potential to accomplish even what politics has thwarted or distorted. A poignant example of this Middle European productive diversity, able to inspire what Magris, in my view, in recurrent terms defines as a European social imaginary, is the possibility of learning to think, quote, with the mentality of several peoples, offered by the literary example of writer Robert, a Hungarian poet who, with multiple pseudonyms embodying different ethnic identities, gives voice in German to the German minority of the Romanian Banat region. This literary example seems to forerun what French philosopher Jean-Marc Ferry has recently proposed as une pensée élargie, so an enlarged way of thinking about Europe and for Europe, precisely born of openness to other people's viewpoints and experiences, to the point of rendering them second nature to oneself. Yet Magris filters this apparently utopian scenario through the critical lens of disenchantment as a form of radical critique of unilateral conclusions and totalizing designs. Indeed, further meditating on the Banat region as a mosaic of peoples, a superimposition and stratification of races, powers, and jurisdictions, the Danubian traveler wonders whether that apparent ability to embody and identify with multiple minds and cultures, as in the case of writer Robert, is actually a unifying synthesis or a heterogeneous jumble, an addition or a subtraction, a way to be more abundant or to be nobody. In this doubt, we see utopian disenchantment working jointly in Magris's thought. Disenchantment precisely as a corrective act, which nonetheless instills new strength in hope and in the journey of utopia. And this journey for Magris has to pass through literary activity, the only domain that can represent contradictions without solving them conceptually. Precisely this fluid trespassing and constant negotiations of social, cultural, and linguistic boundaries in Magris's Middle European liminal space as a kind of creative resistance to both particularist and universalist excesses brings me to my second point, Europe as a translational community. We know, probably, that the Charter for Fundamental Rights of the EU places an obligation on the Union to respect its rich cultural and linguistic diversity, including regional minority languages. However, EU policies are often criticized for approaching language as a kind of static construct rather than as a mutable social process or practice. In order to account for the many thresholds that languages traverse and for the permeability of linguistic formations themselves, the European identification factor should hence become code switching, moving across multilingual repertoires as non-hierarchical practice. This is what led Umberto Eco and also Etienne Balibar to claim that the language of Europe is translation. That is, a constantly transformed system of crossed usages. As a community of people who share a condition of plurisecular colinguism, Europe should hence be imagined as a continent where individuals, even if unable to converse in other languages, do not perceive differences of language as barriers to communication. In other words, a community of translation whose speakers, as Eco writes, have an increased ability to savor different idioms and in which anyone can play the role of interpreter without monopoly. Literature materializes this post-monolingual space of self-transformation and polyvocality, I would say literally, as crossroads of idioms on the page in the work of translingual writers that I also examine in my project, from Christine Brooke-Rose to Yoko Tawada, among others. A more extreme example, however, is a mock artificial European language created as a provocation by Diego Marani, a contemporary Italian writer and translator in the European Union's Council of Ministers in the late 1990s. It is called Europanto, and it grants speakers the freedom to internationalize and contaminate English, Europe's alleged lingua franca, with words borrowed from other European languages and not simply translated, but rather creatively altered to facilitate communication. Now I'm going to show off my knowledge of Europanto. Om Europanto te spiegare, tu basta mixare alles wat tu know in extranges linguas, wat tu non nicht, keine worry to invent. Unlike Esperanto, Europanto has no grammatical or phonetic rules. It democratically encourages individual renditions of a code that is constantly in the making, a kind of self-creolization that provincializes Europe, in Dipesh Chakrabarty's sense, from within. In 1998, Marani wrote a short detective novel entirely in Europanto, Las Aventures or Adventures des Inspector Cabillo. Funny but definitely not silly, it reimagines identity in European terms through a horizontal relational movement across languages and places that breaks away from the confining national dimension as a fiction of homogeneity, as much as from the contested abstract Europeanness imposed from above by EU institutions. Based in Brussels, the Europeana capital city, and moving among various European national and cultural contexts, the protagonist, Inspector Cabillo, est el auténtico europeano polizero, que fighte contra el mal, por eine Europa, fan pax und prosperity, donde se spique eine sola lingua, Europanto. Cabillo's investigations of crimes which parody iconic national problems like mad cow, disease in pre-Brexit Great Britain, or mafia in Italy, are also searches for a higher degree of Europeanness through the inspector's agency in motion. Indeed, with an obvious nod to the famous claim on Italy's nation-building process attributed to Massimo D'Azeglio, l'Italia è fatta, ora dobbiamo fare gli italiani, here, before the make or make Europa, one should have the Europeanos made. Und es was keine Europeano in Europa, es was Franzosos, Hispanicos, Italianos, etc. Aber keine Europeano. Inspector Cabillo was el solo autentico Europeano. We could say that through code mixing and a dynamic plurality of cultural loyalties, Marani combines the Europantization of national languages with the Europeanization of national consciousness. However, what we don't find in the translational space of Europanto are the speaking practices of, for instance, extra-communitarian migrants and refugees. These uneven affordances of mobility and polyglossia cast light upon, we could say, the elephant in the European room, namely the frequent invisibility of those subjects in transit par excellence. Writers based in other European countries, which are also part of my project, like Tahar Benjeloun, Evin Sergi Özdamar, or Kader Abdollah, engage in different ways with questions of Europeanness from the migrants' point of view, not only by narrating the ordeal of their many border crossings, but also by enabling imaginative confluences between Europe and their respective cultures and languages. For its part, migrant and diasporic Italian literature does not yet show a sustained reflection on the European cultural and identitarian component. And here, this is an anecdote. Curiously, during a personal conversation that I had with Java Shego, the Italian Somali writer, she was talking about the different ethnicities that compose herself, her very hybrid identity. I asked her, what percentage of your identity is European? And she proudly responded, 0. So most literature of migration, especially in Italy, is still focused on the binarism between country of origin, often former colony, and national destination culture, or former colonizer, coming to terms with the complexity of belonging to the adoptive homeland and striving for the much coveted and elusive juridical citizenship is understandably more urgent than developing an effective and literary European citizenship. Indeed, as political scientist Nadia Urbinati has extensively discussed, a veritable democratic integration within the EU should imply a perfectly symmetrical right to movement, that is, a right to exit but also to enter. By foregrounding the clash between statelessness and the community of rights, the human and the political, immigrants and refugees thus call for a reconfiguration of European citizenship disentangled from national belonging. It is precisely at the, we could say, the liquid but often impassable Mediterranean frontier, that of a mare nostrum but selectively owned, or along the high-tech border walls in southern Hungary, or on the many invisible dividing lines of still unresolved discrimination, that more than elsewhere, Europe building stands out as an unfinished adventure, as sociologist Zygmunt Bauman has defined it, waiting for many yet untold stories. So, to conclude, as Paul Ricoeur claims, we can imagine a society without ideology, but not a society without utopia, because this would be a society without goals. One of the most urgent goals of the European project, a project which, we should remember, was born of crisis and has been facing crises and challenges all along, remains a constructive dialogue between the cultures of the inside and of the outside, to avoid the risk of replacing the metaphysics of identity with the equally dangerous and totalizing metaphysics of difference, as also Italian philosopher Roberto Esposito observes in his discussion of a philosophy for Europe. But when Europe's self-theorization seems to have reached a conceptual dead end, when, as for instance also Jacques Derrida and Etienne Balibar also claim to devise a new Europe able to shun both monopoly and dispersion, means to think what is difficult to imagine, literature shows us that it is possible and more productive to imagine what is difficult to think, entrusting to the power of creativity to construct what abstract speculation fails to accomplish. As a perpetual investigation, passionate and critical, literature interrogates, indicts, but also amends past and current histories, because it builds the world not as it is, but as it can be made. In the trajectory I have sketched, we have seen snippets of a literary corpus that crafts a European flexible space of contrast and commingling, defeats and hopes, where imagination does not just activate storylines, but also enables activism by entrusting culture with a political project, questioning reality and venturing beyond its constraints to transform it. Through the aspirational thrust of Utopia as the promoter of the doable, storytelling rehumanizes the entangled histories of Europe by ascribing new significance and potentiality to them, beyond a reductive idea of knowledge and truth as functions of mere rationality and power. A wager and a way forward for an old continent, and perhaps for a new global civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I imagine, I hope, that you're here for discussion as well as for listening to this fascinating lecture. And we have plenty of time now for questions and comments. So,
first of all, thank you so much for this very insightful presentation and for guiding us through this grand tour of Europe.
Grand tour de force.
Oh, yeah. So I found particularly interesting the very last section, and I wonder if you could expand a bit more on the post-colonial framing of your work, since you talked about this self-realization, especially in respect to the very origin of the concept of Europe and European leadership. And I was thinking about two main points. One is this idea of the sites of memory in respect to Pierre Nova, which is deemed to be to lack of references to the colonial and imperial legacy of some nations. And the other one is the idea of translation within it, and also this idea of a certain language that dominates over the other. So again, concerning translation.
Definitely. Well, thank you for your questions. They're very comprehensive and very pertinent to this dynamic and multiple space, intellectual space that is Europe. Certainly, when we talk about sites of memory, we're not just talking about venerating a past that can be problematically adopted as a shared patrimony, but also meditate upon the heavy legacy of Eurocentrism and imperialism that inevitably Europe has to come to terms, in addition to the internal horrors that have traumatized Europe itself. So it would be obviously ideological not to talk about it. And in my project, literature is the vehicle through which, as we said, we do not only produce an alternative reality, but also offer a critique of the historical element. So inevitably, it's a dynamic space which has to be analyzed with the instruments and the knowledge that we have right now, which at the same time should not, in my view, this is my personal take on this very big project, throw away what the history of the idea of Europe has been with its limitations, but it has been a pathway that has led us up to here, right? So I'm not creating a teleology and a linear trajectory of cause and effects. It's important to see the pitfalls of the standpoints that have animated even the very ideas of the United States of Europe. Clearly, it is revolving around European states. The main concern was an internal piece, and the rest obviously was peripheral in all senses, not just geographical but also ethical. So clearly it would be univocal to just point to the triumphant story of the 19th century up to now. At the same time, it would be ideological not to allow what the discourse has to say to speak. And it's up to us to take it with a grain of salt and show what the wrong premises are and what could be saved, revised, amended through time. Right? The very idea of the United States of Europe has evolved from an intellectual and not very well defined notion to a diplomatic effort and then a political design, clearly. I don't know whether this answered your question in of itself. And also, let me add one thing, then I get to translation of fantastic. I am really trying to go beyond binarisms. So, center, periphery, north, south, Eurocentric, non-Eurocentric. All this is part of the scenario. It's a very complex scenario, and I want to see the different kinds of ideas of Europe's, in the plural, that emerge from the literary production at different times, again, in a context that is also political, historical, and cultural. Your question about translation, would you mind repeating exactly what your point was, and then we get to that?
The starting point of this idea of European literature or world literature, if you want, with Goethe, and also the dominance of a certain language over the other.
Yes, definitely. So also in the case of Goethe, Goethe tries to go beyond Europe, so the idea of Weltliteratur is mainly shaped by European works, same story with Madame de Stael, exactly. Then how has this fecundated the more recent ideas of world literature in a variety of ways? Let's say it's impossible not to talk about world literature without going back to the history. And this is my approach also. I want this continuity. I want to show that the idea of Europe was not born with the Berlaymont building in Brussels, but it has a long trail, definitely. Again, also in this case, there are asymmetries of all sorts for reasons of history, for reasons of geography. The periphery of Europe, no matter how fluid, is still peripheral. In terms of translation also, because this is important for my choice of primary works, I see that as we approach in the present, many more works are available, also in areas that are not the usual leading nations, France and Germany. The European consciousness is present in many works by Greek, Romanian, Eastern Europe is another important domain. And I hope it's clear, I'm not just trying to recreate a canon of any sort. I'm very, very picky with my choice. I'm looking for works that, in a variety of ways, consciously address questions of Europeanness, be it geographically speaking, be it a concern in terms of content, be it a translingualism that is consciously staging different legacies, linguistic, cultural, etc. So it's a very eclectic corpus, more restricted than the sum of all national literatures. I'm really going beyond that. And so I'm looking for what is being produced. So I'm constantly running after an object that is fluid, so I need to put an end to it, otherwise I will never publish my book. So I'm very sensitive to this idea. And it's very interesting to see the kind of Europeanness that emerges from the periphery with respect to what belongs to the main Western regions of Europe. So not only is your question pertinent from the point of view of languages represented, but also in terms of cultural translation, right? So not just the language, but what this carries across. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, so thank you so much for this articulate and vast presentation. And building on Sandro's question, I was thinking if for the students and for the sake of us who are not contemporary studies, if you could situate your work within the tradition of studies of Europe and the idea of Europe, and Salvo mentioning post-colonialism, when we think of Roberto Gainotto's European theory, and Disenchantment's works on Europe, the beginning of the 19th century, the 20th century, sorry, or being a dentista, was thinking of the idea of Italy, and you mentioning Georgetown, and how the representation of the Italian identity throughout the Italian literary history then comes into a dialectical relationship with Europe. So if you could tell us more about how you situate yourself within the field. Basically.
Thank you, very vast question. I start with one remark that really, how can I say, shows how I relate to the issue of Italian identity, etc. If we think of the Risorgimento, so we Italians are in a sort of privileged position, because if there is one thing that we can say very fast, but probably accurately about the Risorgimento is that it's really a discourse that becomes reality, right? So the nation is born of desires, of plans that have turned into something concrete. So it's the best example of what, in a sense, we're talking about for Europe as an idea, right? So there is nothing concrete that precedes the representation. Let's say that Europe is an invention. Perfect. We see a similar dynamic in the Risorgimento, to the point that many people who are against the administrative notion of Europe say that precisely as the Risorgimento is a top-down thing. The Risorgimento was not a movement of people, it was a movement of bourgeois or aristocrats that had this idea, and in the end the people followed suit, right? And so, in this respect, there is an interesting inversion of referent and signifier and signified. In general, identity. I'm not certainly claiming that there is a univocal European identity, absolutely not. It's a pluralism, not only of identities, but of discourses that have come to terms with that. Italy, perfect example of a multiplicity of realities at the local level that can also show us what it means to be brought together while maintaining a local element. My way of proceeding is, as I said, I want to avoid simple binarisms. I'm taking into consideration different ways of reinterpreting this history of ideas. Many voices have contributed to it. As I said, no matter what you mention, you can find an opposite rendition of what the idea of Europe is or is not. What I'm interested in is to make sources speak. Literature has not been in the scenario, and this is not only my primary source, but also the lens through which I can somewhat reappraise what has been said about Europe in general. So certainly I take into consideration all the possible questioning of a monolithic Europe, because I am not claiming that it is such, and it's important to incorporate these tensions with the help of documents. So pronouncements of political scientists, philosophers, intellectuals at different stages in different areas of Europe. My project is very comparative, and so I'm bringing together what I showed tonight about Italy is the tip of the iceberg. There is a constant confluence of text from other nations. So there are different points of view about this object at every moment of my trajectory from the 19th century to the present. So yeah, in which order? Should I also moderate here? How can I choose? How can I choose?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that very rich presentation and lecture. I'm looking at the Russian bear here, and I'm thinking what a tragedy that Putin has chosen, instead of integration, peace with Europe, has chosen aggression, war, with tragic consequences for his own people and for the people of Ukraine. And I'm wondering if in your studies and in the sense of Europeanness, so we see countries seeking to join the European Union, and Ukraine seeking to join the European Union and wanting the freedom to align itself with Europe and not with Russia and its imperialist projects. And we see countries seeking to join the European Union and countries being added to NATO.
Yes.
So how, in your studies, Ukraine will no doubt be, the world will learn about its presentation of itself to be part of Europe. So what will they be using? What will the Ukrainian intellectuals and the politicians, where will they look for this entry? How will they articulate their Europeanness? Or how do your studies fit with this moment of tragedy that we're living?
Yes, it's definitely a tragedy, as you say. Ukraine is part, obviously here, talking about translation. I wish the dream of a comparatist is to know all the languages of the world so that every work can be accessed in the original language. I don't know Ukrainian, and I'm using, luckily, for instance, we had Oksana Zabushko, Georgetown, I invited her 2 years ago. Oksana Zabushko is a very good example of this, and so she will be part of my project, in addition to other new works that are coming out on the issue of borders. Zabushko is the perfect example because she combines, I would say, a rather nationalistic, I mean, I don't want to sound extreme, but obviously she is advocating for her country and she's very passionate about the drama of this region. But there is also the indictment to Europe that should have watched more carefully what was going on. There is this feeling that Ukraine is definitely part of the West and part of Europe. And so yes, the Museum of Abandoned Secrets is part of my work. So yes, my answer is absolutely. So Ukraine is part of my work. There are essays that are coming out, and I'm working on that precisely now. Now, the enlargement, the novel by Menasse, is already somewhat questioning the role of the new nations that are asking to be admitted, and inevitably I am monitoring that as well, Albania, etc. Kapka Kasabova is talking about, she's also part of my project, natural borders between Northern Macedonia, Albania, and Greece, as ways of transcending the man-made divisions, and so fascinating way in which the use of space or geography can offer a counter discourse to these artificial fractures and fragmentations that have divided pieces of Europe from Europe itself and bringing them to the other side. So definitely Eastern Europe and Ukraine are my models. Then, for instance, the Mediterranean, which is implicit when I'm talking about refugees. Mediterranean, again, trying to go beyond the binarism. The Mediterranean is Europe, a very problematic threshold, and so we have to be aware of the responsibility that Europe has. The freedoms and all the other values on which the EU is built also pertain to these new citizens or non-citizens yet. They are there. That's why it's our, let's say, main ethical task. But so, the Mediterranean is Europe. I'm thinking of Edi Bouhaoui. Edi Bouhaoui is somebody who is trying to go against the binarism, Europe versus the Mediterranean. Let's rethink our identities in ways that can incorporate these communications without forgetting the asymmetries of which European history is responsible. So I'm really looking for those writers who are able to offer a new, let's call it hopeful, but not necessarily, I don't want to sound too ironic. I'm trying to strike a balance between the gratuitously polemic and the blissfully ironic. This is my motto, okay? That's why literature as a critic of reality, not just a reproduction. I hope I answered the question. Yeah. Now, Professor Cacci.
I think I saw Matt's hand first. What if we all alternate? Do you want to jump in with your question? Yeah.
Can I? Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to ask about La Nostra Vita, with Sara, we've been reading novels from the 19th century, and the first one we read was La Nostra Vita. And a doubt that we had in our discussions was about Mantegazza's perspective and personal view on what he was writing. So we were debating, is this ironic at all? Are there elements which are, because of course he's anthropologist, pathologist, concerned about hygiene, concerned about medicine and disease. So when he's saying, offering a vision of a world where there's no pain, no disease, no suffering, that's maybe not ironic, but there's parts of it, the ending, for example, that we said, does he believe in this? Is this truly a utopia? Is this the sogno? Is it a bad dream? Is it a good dream? So I was wondering your opinion on La Nostra Vita as a utopia or not.
Right. No, thank you. I would say it's a mixture. So I'm going in your direction, in the sense that he's an optimist. Okay. So anything that the future can offer that is better than what we have right now is a kind of objective that we need to pursue. And so clearly this is, to our eyes, a flaw of the 19th century, right? So this idea of progress as a linear univocal trajectory. I don't want to say devoid of ethical concerns, but clearly it was a sort of religion, especially for an Italy that had, started occupying a space on the European scene with some delay with respect to other nations. So clearly there is this idea in him, a kind of motto of always looking for an excelsior. Now, the higher you go, there are always goals that you have to continue pursuing. L'anno 3000 is also a journey through different options, political options, ethical options, social options, a way of testing, a way of probing and checking what works better. In this travel through the future, going to Anthropolis for this kind of biological approval, considering, for instance, eugenics. Then if you read Un giorno a Madeira, you realize that essentially he was trying to avoid producing new generations of biologically flawed individuals, right? So in some cases, when he is describing to Maria what is going on, what will be going on, he's also trying to selectively decide what procedures are good and what do not work. Yeah. In terms of pain, again, this improves, taking away pain is fantastic, right? So this improves the conditions of human beings, also thinking of his Almanacchi Igienico Popolari, the idea of improving living conditions for everyone, pursuing something better. So I don't know whether this answers your question, but yeah, so not necessarily parodies, but a way of testing and deciding what works better.
Yeah,
He has
go for it.
forgotten his question.
Well, I guess what strikes me about the analysis is its complete detachment from geopolitical reality. And I think that, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, this was Italian law and so on. But I think the current political situation that John is alluding to is a gigantic problem for all those who are still thinking about Stati Uniti d'Europa. I mean, the Marshall Plan is what saved Europe as led to the European Union. And I mean, I guess my request, or what I would like to know more about how one explains the total failure of the European project. And, besides the fact that what Europe needs is an army, a little bit of, I don't know if you consider Machiavelli's Prince of Utopia, but I think a little more Machiavelli would help to contextualize what's actually going on. And I would look at it in much more perilous terms than John. Europe is completely vulnerable from the American side, from the Russian side, and all of the literary, whatever you want to call it, whether it's Derrida or whatever, has proven, from where I'm sitting, has proven not to be a particularly effective means of intervening in real geopolitical conditions. And so I think it's a challenge for those of us who study literature to try to figure out, like these 19th century authors that you're talking about, how is it that, whether it's the Risorgimento or whatever, that it leads to Mussolini and Hitler? How is it that all of these beautiful thoughts and reflections and humanistic, poetic ideals and how do you explain the failure of literature to actually change the world and make a difference? I think that that's something that literary scholars, humanists, really need to reflect more on. And how can, if indeed there's a desire to have a political impact or, an influence in society. But I'm sorry not to rain on the utopian parade, but I found all of the authors that you were talking about to be fascinating and very interesting, including the contemporary authors who are part of the current discussion. But again, I think more than ever, I just came back from Italy, and anybody who's spent some time in Europe, I think more than ever, one has the sense of a failure of a literary and political and intellectual culture. And of course, in Trump's America, I'm not saying that we have any, we don't have anything to, we're part of the problem. But nonetheless, the problems are geopolitical, and they are military, and they are trade, economically based. And so if you just look at things from the perspective of the superstructure, I feel, and again, it's a friendly response.
Sure.
I felt that the detachment between what you're talking about, what's going on the ground right now. I mean, the Brits, so much for Europe.
Absolutely. Was England ever in Europe, technically?
Well, they were certainly in Europe. It depends on how you look at it. Okay, so this is Bauer's question, I thought. So I think European identity goes back to discoveries and explorations, and it was Europe, either Africa and Asia,
Absolutely.
and America. And that's, we are inheritors of that Europe, which is the imperial colonial, it's all mixed up, but I really think that, that idea of Europe, the Brits are very much a part of it. And they were also very much a part of defending Europe during the Cold War. I mean, just look at Churchill and what that meant for pulling Europe out of the apocalypse and defending it from communism during the Cold War. So, I'm sorry.
No, it's fascinating because here we go back to the idea of what kind of Europe are we expecting, right? So we can't really imagine that the only political solution is the United States of Europe. So as I said, there are theoreticians, Habermas, do we need more Europe or less Europe from the administrative point of view? The idea of an army or a fiscal system unifying Europe is for those who think that a stronger administrative structure is the solution. There are other thinkers who say, well, shared sovereignty, shared governance, and another way of imagining what brings these areas, these cultures together can be an alternative. So, do we need more Europe? Yes, especially from the civic point of view. We could say that, as many fathers and pioneers of Europe mentioned, we don't fall in love with the market, so there is a kind of symbolic deficit that culture can contribute to. Paradoxically, if we take a look at the contemporary literary panorama, you have no idea how many discussions and how many writers are beginning precisely to talk about the need for literature to engage with the notion of Europe. So it's an extremely productive moment. Is it an elegy for Europe? We don't know. I mean, we as humanists have I would even say the moral duty to believe in the power of words, okay? The humanities can rehumanize the world, sharing the notion of Europe as something that is common, even though imagined in different ways, in curricula, appreciating all that Europe is doing that we take for granted from the cultural point of view, starting from Erasmus, starting from many cultural initiatives. As Henri De Luca writes in Pagine Europee, he says, well, young generations cannot understand what it means to be able to cross frontiers, from one state to the other without even bothering. So Schengen, with all its flaws, I'm not saying, sometimes merchandise crosses borders more easily than people, okay, but so, and once again, that's why the historical perspective is important. We take for granted many things and we complain about what we do not have. Obviously, I'm not here to solve the problem of Europe. My point is, literature is a crucial component of this discourse that historically has been produced. It's not in the scenario in a systematic way. I want to do that because I think that it's again an element that has to be in the framework, and let's take a look at what the literature is doing at different moments to address also these concerns, because again, it's not that there is a univocal message that emerges. It can be an SOS that the literature is sending. I want to see how literature sends this SOS. So again, in moments of crisis, one could say maybe believing in more Europe, having politicians, this is my personal opinion, my opinion doesn't have any more value than anybody in the street, but again, I'm not a politician, seeing who represents us at the level of Europe, people who probably do not have a knowledge of what the idea of Europe was in the past is detrimental, or seeing that what is being brought to European institutions is just a series of very petty national things, European elections as a magnification of what could happen easily within one nation, but no real European vision. So also this means a way of re-educating politicians, not accidentally. Every now and then the European Commission, the European Parliament invite writers, intellectuals. There is so much documentation about it. Saramago went to the European Parliament to talk, Magris, all those people. So there's the manifesto of writers for Europe. I mean, I take this thing seriously, as a kind of sociological phenomenon. It has to be in the scenario, and it's not. And then, fingers crossed, absolutely. Maybe my book will be an archaeology of what Europe used to be. We still write about Shakespeare, etc. There is room for that as well. So.
Yes. First of all, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. I have two questions. So the first one would be, so of course you're working across different languages, and I was wondering, to what extent do these authors read each other across the boundaries? Are they aware that there are other authors outside of their country writing similar ideas about Europe, or are they paradoxically all writing about Europe but within their own?
Very nice question. I would say it's a mix. Most of these people, again, I'm trying not to generalize because my corpus is really, really broad, but now that you make me think about it, many of them, and it depends on the period, right? So even with the very small sample that I've shared with you tonight, we see that these people are inevitably international, either because they know languages, they spend time abroad, so cross-fertilization of all sorts is part of their formation. So I would say, on many occasions, yes, these are people who know about what is going on. Now, do they target precisely that other novel that talks about Europe? Not necessarily, but also their pronouncements about their work, so in more general terms, shows that there are dialogues. Especially what I see, really it's a very recent phenomenon, is also collections of works, anthologies of young emerging writers, all under the aegis of Europe. Europe 28, Europa Trans Express or something like that. So a deliberate intent to bring under the aegis of European concerns new voices who, whether they knew each other or not, end up being in the same collection. So there is also this element, which is fascinating. Again, this desire to talk about not just examples of emerging writers with a national identity, but writers who question national boundaries and who examine or see themselves as part of a European framework. But thank you for this question. It's very...
Can I ask the second question? Or should
Please, yeah.
So my second question goes back to what Salvo asked earlier.
Yeah.
Going back to the post-colonial aspect,
Yes.
I was wondering, since you also at some point of the presentation you mentioned the people being born in colonies and moving to their former colonizer,
Yes.
which, as we know, Italy is a bit of an exception to that because immigration does not come from former colonies.
Right.
So I was wondering if you're thinking of looking into whether there are some differences in the way Europe is perceived by migrants or second-generation authors coming from colonies, rather, and I mean coming from the colonies of the country that they moved to, and those that moved to different countries, and connected to this, perhaps the answer to the question, do you feel European, that you asked to Ijaba Shego, will it be different for authors coming from?
Again, difficult, impossible to answer with certainty about each author. What let's say, general lines that I see, and this is the corpus that is in progress, I'm constantly monitoring, etc., and many things are coming up. Many authors, as I said, are still caught into homeland, colonized homeland, and the relationship with the colonizers' space. So even though geographically and juridically they find themselves in Europe, there is no interest in engaging with this wider space and possibilities. Other ones, either because they indict Europe as, this big burden, obviously responsible for all the bad things of the past, or because of their spatial displacements, and so there is a contact, a direct contact, or also a linguistic one with different realities, then have a broader perspective, and so richer in terms of engagements, differences, etc. Then there is also this difference, how their legacies, or cultural elements, are in dialogue with the local culture. What do they do with the local culture? Do they appropriate it in such a way that it can also become a kind of European literary passport? There are very interesting initiatives. So for instance, also in Italy, Abdullah Mehdi, who goes, so he's a cultural mediator, right, from Somalia, who goes to Ventotene, which is, for me, is great, and tries to make this space, which is the quintessential let's say, European space. We exported a great Europeanism. Now there's a building devoted to Spinelli in the European Union. And making this history, which is Italian and European by definition, meaningful for new Italian citizens, let's say, if not juridical, people who belong in Italy, but who come from other spaces. These are the kinds of, I would say, exchanges. I'm not saying that they have to be unidirectional, meaning we impose Europeanness upon them, but also the other way around. Kader Abdollah, Iranian Dutch, very fascinating figure, who blends his culture also in terms of literary genres. So adjusting motifs and also genres, poetic genres, to a narrative that by now is European and writing in Dutch. So these are the authors that interest me a great deal. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a great place to conclude, so I hope you'll join me in thanking our... Camera goes up. I don't know whether it's fortuitous or not that the restaurant we chose for this evening is the Evil Check.
Ah.